Our National Security Advisor, Mr. Ajit Doval, is visiting Russia on 5th of August 2025. Now, this visit becomes extremely important as this has been timed amidst the rising US pressure on India for purchasing Russian crude oil. Hello and welcome to Drishti IAS. My name is Saloni Nankyoliar, and today we will understand the importance of this visit and also the changing dynamics of India-US and India-Russia bilateral relations. So, Mr. Doval is visiting Moscow on 5th August 2025. And the timing becomes very important because US has been threatening to increase its tariff and also impose penalties on India because India has been continuously purchasing crude oil from Russia despite USA's sanction on Russia. So US had imposed economic and financial sanctions on Russia after the Russia-Ukraine conflict of 2022. But despite those sanctions, we have been continuously procuring crude oil from Russia. So this visit stands as a testament to the long-standing partnership and friendship that we have with Russia, the long-standing strategic cooperation that we have with Russia across different sectors, oil and energy being one of them. So Mr. Doval's agenda is likely to focus on economic and security coordination, and we are also seeking an alternative to the SWIFT financial system because the SWIFT financial system is largely dominated by Western countries and it deals in US dollars. Now, because Russia has been removed from the SWIFT financial system, it gets very difficult to do trade with Russia. That is why we are looking for alternatives to this SWIFT financial system so that we are not dependent solely on one system that is largely dominated by one country or a set of countries. So this is what the current situation looks like. And if we talk about USA's pressure, so globally, US has been exerting pressure on countries who are doing trade with Russia, because US has imposed sanctions on Russia. So we have also been threatened that our tariffs will be increased from 25% to a much higher rate. In fact, penalties will also be imposed on us if we do not stop doing our trade with Russia. We have also been warned of secondary sanctions because we are a Russian oil buyer like China. So what are secondary sanctions? Secondary sanctions are the sanctions that are imposed on third parties. For example, if US has imposed sanctions on Russia, then any other country who's doing trade with Russia will be a third party. So secondary sanctions can be imposed on third parties like India and China. So we have been warned of secondary sanctions and we have also been threatened that our tariffs will be increased. So what has our response been? In our official statement, we have called these remarks or these threats to be unjustified and unreasonable. In fact, you recall, Trump had also went ahead and said that the economies of Russia and India are dead economies. So we have called out these remarks, these threats, these actions to be unjustified and unreasonable. Unjustified because India is doing trade with Russia. We are procuring crude oil from Russia solely to protect our national economic interests. We are a sovereign nation. We have every right to protect our national economic interest, and that is the reason that we are procuring crude oil from Russia. It is not driven out of any geopolitical agenda or geopolitical interest. That is why these remarks are unjustified and unreasonable because while US and the European Union countries, they are threatening other countries of imposing sanctions if they do trade with Russia, they themselves are doing trade with Russia. For example, the US has been doing trade with Russia in uranium hexafluoride for its nuclear sector and in palladium for its electronic vehicle sector. So it itself is doing trade with Russia. The European Union countries are also doing trade with Russia in LNG imports or in chemicals, fertilizers, iron and steel. So India has called out this duplicity of European Union and USA that they are threatening other countries of tariffs and secondary sanctions, but they themselves are doing trade with Russia. So this is what the situation is. And if we look at India's energy and security perspective, why is it so important for us to procure this crude oil from Russia? It is because we are the third largest consumer of oil in the world after USA and China. And our domestic production is not sufficient to meet our needs. We can only meet 10 to 15% of our needs from what we produce domestically. The rest 85 to 90% has to be imported. This is what our current situation is. In fact, before the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we were importing approximately 0.2% of crude oil from Russia, but because of the economic sanctions, the Russian crude oil became cheaper and we started importing approximately 40% of crude oil from Russia. But why did this oil become cheaper? So the Russian crude oil became cheaper because of multiple reasons. First, due to Western sanctions and price cap mechanism. So because these Western countries, they imposed sanctions on Russia, Russian crude oil became more expensive in its traditional market of European Union. European Union used to import close to 50% of its crude oil from Russia, and because the Russian crude oil became expensive, the traditional markets were not importing from it. So Russia had to look for new buyers like India and China. And how will the new buyers come in? When it offers discounted prices. So in order to lure the new buyers, because of the Western sanctions, Russian crude oil became cheaper, and more people, like countries like India and China, they became interested in procuring this oil from Russia. Then Russia has also been removed from the SWIFT financial system. Now, because of this, it is not able to deal in US dollars, and majority of the global transactions, they happen in US dollar. So it has to rely on local currencies like ruble, and these currencies, they are less liquid than US dollar. That is why, again, in order to lure the newer buyers, we have to offer them discounted price. And lastly, what Russia offers is Ural grade crude oil. Ural grade crude oil is different from Brent and WTI or West Texas Intermediate. So Ural grade is heavier and it is sour, which means that more money has to go in refining this crude oil, versus Brent, which is the most widely used because it is seaborne, it is easier to ship, and WTI, which is the lightest. So it is quality wise, it is the best, but it is mostly landlocked. So now Ural grade crude oil requires more refinement, requires more money to be invested in it. Again, in order to lure these new buyers, we'll have to offer them discounted prices. That is why the Russian crude oil has become cheaper, and because of that, in order to protect our national interests, we have been importing from Russia. Now, Mr. Jaishankar's visit is also upcoming. He is also supposed to visit Russia in the upcoming days. For example, let's say towards the end of August, we'll be able to see his visit also. And he has called out for a fair and representative global order. A fair and representative global order which is not largely dominated by one country or a few countries. We need to have a multipolar world, a multipolar diplomacy here. So that is the reason that this visit also becomes very important, and hopefully we'll be covering that also in the upcoming videos. And what is the way forward for India here? So India is going to continue to uphold its strategic partnership. We are not going to back down. However, we are looking for alternatives also, alternative energy avenues also, if the Western sanctions escalate, which means that we are diversifying our pool of options so that we are not solely dependent on Russian crude oil for our energy needs. Then we are aiming to push for a multipolar world and represent the interests of emerging economies more strongly. And we also need to recalibrate our talks with or our relations with USA, because we were under negotiations on agriculture and digital taxation, which have now been stalled because of these tariff situations. So we need to recalibrate our situation with the USA. We also need to recalibrate our situation with Russia, and we also need to expand or diversify our pool of options. So that was all for today's video. I hope you understood the discussion. Now let us practice a question for prelims. Which of the following statements about the current India-US-Russia situation are correct? 1. India imports over 40% of its crude oil from Russia in 2025. 2. The US has threatened secondary sanctions on countries importing Russian oil. 3. India has officially suspended its purchases of Russian oil following US injunctions. Choose the correct statements. A. 1 and 2 only. B. 2 and 3 only. C. 1 only. D. 2 only. Please provide your answers in the comment section, and we will meet in the next video.
For more informative content, like, share and subscribe, and do not forget to press the bell icon to get the notifications.